Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we fall face first into the soot-soaked, ale-scented misery of 18th century England, where marriage is less a sacred bond and more a social inconvenience with taxes. You wake up on a lumpy straw mattress that creaks with every sigh of despair. There's no pillow, just a sack of turnip stems wrapped in cloth, and the blanket is more whole than thread. A mouse is living under your bed. His name is probably George. He eats better than you do. The cottage smells of mildew, boiled onions, and the regret of early matrimony. Your husband, whose name doesn't really matter because he'll soon be auctioning you off like a wheel of cheese gone soft, is snoring beside you, mouth open, reeking of last night's beer and general apathy. You could move to get more comfortable. But what's the point? You're 22. Which means you're somewhere between middle-aged and why haven't you died in childbirth yet? The roof leaks when it rains. The floor leaks when it doesn't. Privacy is a myth. You share space not just with him, but with the occasional drunk neighbor, 3 chickens, and your own mounting existential dread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough. Drop your location and local time in the comments, because misery shared is misery doubled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out of bed in your one and only shift, the same one you've worn for 3 years. It smells like boiled wool and disappointment. The wooden floor stabs your feet with every splinter because shoes are for the wealthy or the dead. You toss water on your face, which is cold enough to count as a religious experience. There is no soap, just sand and shame. Breakfast. It's a crust of bread so hard it could double as a home defense weapon. You dunk it in weak ale, because water is more of a theory than a safe beverage in your town. Historians still argue whether this reliance on ale was practical hydration or just collective denial with a frothy head. You glance at your husband. He doesn't look back. He hasn't in years. You once thought marriage was about love. Turns out it's more about shared poverty and passive grunts. Love, in this era, is reserved for things like cows and bacon. You're just here for the taxes and the labor. There are rumors, though. Whispers of couples who split, not with court orders or paperwork, but with halters and auction blocks. You laugh when you first hear it. But the laughter doesn't reach your eyes. Because deep down, you know, in a world where women are property, being sold isn't freedom, but it might be an exit. You step outside. The morning mist clings to everything like a bad debt. The cobbled street smells of chamber pots and burnt barley. Children cry. Horses relieve themselves. A neighbor mutters about his wife being more trouble than she's worth. You pretend not to notice the looks. Everyone sees it now. The distance between you and your husband. The way the baker's apprentice lingers too long with your change. The way you no longer care. In the 18th century, a marriage isn't built on compatibility, it's built on necessity, habit, and shared silence. The church says it's forever. The market says otherwise. And as the week unfolds, the whispers grow louder. She's been unfaithful. She's for sale. She's got the eyes of someone who might walk away. And you just keep chewing that rock-hard bread, because you know you won't have to eat it much longer. The wind blows like it knows a secret, and spoiler alert, it does. Everyone does. You feel it in the way your neighbor coughs just a little louder when you pass. In the way the blacksmith's wife tugs her child a bit closer, as if treachery were a sneeze you might pass along. Adultery in 18th century England isn't about passion or betrayal, it's about property. And when a wife strays, the village doesn't ask why, it asks who owns her now. You haven't even confessed, but your silence is evidence enough. The cooper's apprentice, barely of age, soft around the chin but sweet with his words, has been too kind. And in this world, kindness from the wrong man is as good as a confession. There's no need for courts or clerics. There's a far more efficient system in place: gossip. Side-eye. and the sharp-edged laughter of market women. You wake each morning to fewer greetings and longer stares. Your husband doesn't speak much, but his silence has changed. It used to be neglect. Now it's calculation. He polishes his boots more often, shaves his patchy beard. He's preparing, and not for reconciliation. He's rehearsing his lines. One day, you overhear him at the tavern, voice raised with ale and pride. She's got hips for work and a tongue for trouble. She'll go cheap. The others laugh, slap his back, and raise their pints. You are not invited to the punchline. Here's your mainstream historical fact by the late 1700s. Wife-selling was a known, if legally murky, practice among England's lower classes. In the absence of accessible divorce, husbands would lead their wives to market, halter around the waist or neck, and publicly auction them off, often for symbolic sums like a pint of beer. It was vulgar. It was theatrical, and yes, it was very real. It was, your home becomes a stage, and you unwilling actress keep playing the part of the shamed wife. You clean, cook, feed the chickens, but your footsteps have become too light, too careful. You're walking on glass that hasn't even shattered yet. You tell yourself you could run, take the road to Bristol, change your name, live as a widow with no past. But you know the truth without papers, a man's name, or a coin to your name. Freedom is more myth than plan. And besides, he's already told the town, and the town has already decided. The cooper's apprentice still smiles when he sees you, but his steps have grown more hesitant. His kindness now feels like a weight around your neck. You don't know if he's afraid of scandal or the halter. Maybe both. Here's your fringe tidbit. At least one recorded wife sale included a ceremonial kiss between buyer and seller, symbolizing not affection, but the closing of a deal. Historians still argue whether these moments were grotesque parody or a society's desperate attempt to mimic legal form in a world with no room for poor people's law. The day before market, your husband brings out the rope. He lays it on the table like a loaf of bread. You don't speak. He doesn't need your consent. He already has the crowds. That night, you sit by the hearth, staring into the fire. Your fingers trace the hem of your dress. Your only dress. You wonder if you should wash it. You decide not to. Let them see the soot. Let them smell the work. Let them know they're not buying a doll. They're buying a woman with a name, even if no one bothers to ask for it. The next morning, the town square will become a theater, and you will stand center stage, with a rope around your waist, and your pride hanging by a thread. It's market day. Normally, that would mean noise, fish guts, and children with sticky hands stealing apples they can't afford. But today, the air hums with something heavier anticipation, not for butter or barley, but for spectacle. You step outside, and already the stares are different, less curious, more entertained. You don't walk alone. Your husband, soon-to-be ex in the most public sense possible, holds the rope. It loops loosely around your waist like a leash made for pride, not restraint. You could easily take it off, but where would you go? You're not bound by the rope. You're bound by the theater of it. Everyone expects a show, and the crowd is already gathering. He leads you like livestock through the square. Children point. A few older women shake their heads in what might be judgment or pity. It's hard to tell when you're the main act in a morality play no one asked for. One man whistles. Another shouts. She any good with a churn, and laughter peals through the crowd like rotten bells. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Wife-selling, though never legally sanctioned under English common law, became a widely acknowledged method of dissolving marriages among the lower classes. These events were often held in public markets and carried out with ceremonial pomp. A halter was usually required, along with some form of public bidding and witness agreement. Newspapers recorded them. Crowds adored them. Your feet feel heavier with every step. You remember stories of other women, some who cried, some who smiled, one who supposedly brought her own halter to speed things up. You'd laughed at that one once. You're not laughing now. At the center of the square, your husband finds a crate, an old turnip box, if the stains are anything to go by. He pats it with satisfaction and gestures for you to stand. You hesitate. Only a breath. But it's long enough for the crowd to lean in. Up, woman, he says. Don't waste their time. You climb. The wood is rough. It creaks. Someone throws a cabbage leaf. It misses. Another voice shouts, "What's the starting bid?" He begins. He lists your traits the way a butcher might describe a cow. Strong arms. Good teeth, what's left of them. Can carry 2 buckets without spilling. Knows how to silence a crying babe, though not always gently. You say nothing. Because what can you say that isn't swallowed by the snorts and guffaws? And then he adds the part that really makes the crowd buzz. She's not faithful, but she's warm. You hear laughter. You hear coins clinking. You hear your name not said, but sold. Here's your fringe tidbit: some recorded wife sales ended in bidding wars, especially if the woman was young, strong, or had no children. One wife fetched more than 5 guineas. Another went for a jug of cider and a brindled dog. Historians still argue whether these events were actual contracts or theatrical ways to shift blame for separation. Today, your price is lower. A man at the back, the cooper's apprentice, steps forward. He raises 1 coin. Not much, but more than nothing. Your husband eyes him, nods. You can have her. A woman gasps, possibly from joy, possibly from envy. It's hard to know anymore. A constable watches from the shadows. He says nothing. Because nothing in this town is illegal until someone important is embarrassed by it. The apprentice takes the rope gently. He doesn't pull. He just holds it like a ribbon. Awkward and loose. You step down from the crate, careful not to trip over the same pride you left behind. The deal is done. There is no paperwork, no priest, just a halter, a coin, and a crowd of strangers who will spend the next week retelling this story as if they wrote it. You walk home with a rope around your waist and the cooper's apprentice now. Apparently, your new husband holding the end of it like it's too sacred or too absurd to drop. The crowd doesn't follow. They've had their fun. There are turnips to weigh and rumors to inflate. Your former husband is already back at the tavern, likely retelling the sale with more flair than facts. The apprentice clears his throat once, then again. Finally, he says, "We can take it off, you know." You stop walking. You untie the halter yourself. It falls like a joke that lasted too long. The road is muddy, the air thick with the scent of horses and burnt barley. But compared to what you've just left behind, a name traded for a coin and a comment, this walk feels like the first one you've taken as your own. You're not free, not really, but you're also not his anymore. Here's your mainstream historical fact while not legally binding in the eyes of the English courts. These public sales were often honored informally in working-class communities, if the sale had witnesses, and no one raised objections. Society considered the couple separated. No divorce, no paperwork, just halters, handshakes, and ale. Your new home is smaller than the last one, somehow. But it doesn't smell of old sweat and dried beer. Instead, it smells like wood shavings, beeswax, and nervousness. He's tidied up, badly, but earnestly. A loaf of dark bread waits on the table beside a chipped mug of cider. There's even a single flower in a cup, wilted from overwatering. He clears his throat again. You can have the bed, I'll take the floor. You don't answer, you don't sit, you just stare at the table, at the bread, at your future, all of it slightly stale, slightly crooked, slightly better than before. You break the silence with the only honest thing you can offer. I'm not property. He nods, I know. You don't believe him yet, but it's a start. That night, you lie on straw that doesn't smell like rot. You curl your legs, breathe deep, and wait for the shame to settle. It doesn't. Not entirely, but it lingers a little less. The neighbors talk. Of course they do. You're the woman who was sold like cattle. Some say you brought shame to the town. Others say you got away easy. And one baker's daughter whispers that maybe it was romantic. He bought her, didn't he, she says, as if being exchanged like a turnip could somehow be a love story. Here's your fringe tidbit. In at least one reported case, a woman allegedly encouraged her husband to sell her so she could legally live with her lover. In another, A wife insisted on bringing her favorite cooking pot into the sale, refusing to be traded without her good stew pan. Historians still argue whether these stories are genuine anecdotes or satirical inventions spread by pamphlets and gossip mongers. The apprentice, his name is Thomas. You finally remember, doesn't ask for anything. He leaves food, nods politely, and says good morning like it's not something you stopped expecting. You don't trust it. Not yet. Trust in your world is like warm socks, rare, suspicious, and probably full of holes. You tell yourself this isn't freedom, but it might be survival with better lighting. The rope, folded neatly, sits on the mantel. Neither of you has touched it, but neither of you throws it away. Because no matter how absurd the ceremony, no matter how degrading the act, that rope, for better or worse, is how your second life began. Days pass, maybe weeks. Time isn't something you track so much as survive. The cottage is quieter than your last. No snoring, no shouting, no furniture being kicked just to make a point. Thomas the cooper's apprentice. The accidental husband goes to work each morning and returns with sawdust in his hair and ale on his breath. But not in his mouth. You think that might be progress. You settle into the rhythm like a bruise settling into skin. You chop wood, he builds barrels, you mop the floor, he fixes the hinge on the door. It's not passion, it's not romance. But it also doesn't come with threats or leashes. And in your current measuring system, that feels suspiciously close to happiness. Still, every now and then, someone stares at you too long at the market or whispers "that's her" a little too loudly. You hear the word "sold" like it's stitched into your clothes, as if it happened last night, not last month. You try not to care. You fail. Here's your mainstream historical fact in 18th century England. Marriage for the working classes was often more contractual than emotional. Love was considered a fragile luxury, especially among the poor. Wife-selling, although technically illegal, emerged as an informal alternative to expensive and inaccessible divorce procedures. The halter acted as both a literal and symbolic gesture of ownership being transferred. One evening, Thomas asks if you want to join him at the tavern. You blink. Me, he nods. You're allowed to have a drink, too. It feels like a trap, but you go. You wear your best meaning least patched apron and brush the hay from your hair. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and spilled cider. Someone coughs, someone laughs, someone whispers again. That's her. But Thomas doesn't flinch. He orders 2 mugs, places one in front of you. And for a second, the room tilts not from the drink, but from the unfamiliar weight of not being hidden. Here's your fringe tidbit in some towns. Women who had been sold were viewed as unlucky or even cursed, thought to bring misfortune to their new homes. In other places, they were seen as survivors, clever enough to navigate a loophole that wasn't made for them. Historians still argue whether the practice empowered women or further cemented their status as property. You sip slowly. You don't smile, but you don't scowl either. It's a good drink, not freedom in a glass, but something close. That night, back in the cottage, you stand by the hearth and ask him, do you regret it? He frowns, puzzled. Buying you. You nod. He shakes his head. You weren't for sale, not really. You stare at the halter still folded on the mantel. That's not what it looked like. No, he says quiet, but I knew what it felt like. And for the first time, you wonder if he didn't just buy a wife that day. Maybe he saved one. Maybe. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the crowd, the crate, the coin, but it softens the corners of it. And in a world made of splinters, softness is a revolution. The days grow longer, or at least less sharp. You stop counting them. That, in itself, is a quiet form of healing. Your hands stay busy laundry, stew, sweeping ashes, but your mind stops replaying the market day like a broken fiddle. You're not a wife now in the way the law sees it, but society has a different set of paperwork, the stares, the whispers, the invisible ink of shame that clings to your shoulders no matter how many times you scrub. Still, you laugh now, not loudly, not often, but sometimes in the kitchen, When Thomas drops a spoon or tries to explain the fine art of barrel hoop binding like it's a royal science, something in you chuckles before you can stop it. The sound surprises you. It feels like yours. You take a walk one morning, just you, alone, no rope, no husband shadowing your steps. The lane is muddy, but the hedges are thick with new green. Spring has arrived. Flowers poke up like they're trying to apologize for winter. A child runs past, barefoot, yelling nonsense at a goat. You smile. Back in town, the chatter hasn't died down, only shifted. You are still the one who got sold, but now it's said with less venom, more curiosity. Like you've become a walking story that doesn't quite end the way it should. A few women nod to you in the market. One even gives you the fresher carrots. That's basically a medal. Here's your mainstream historical fact in many documented cases. A wife sale functioned as a socially tolerated method of separation that even courts turned a blind eye to. It was understood that once the wife had been purchased, typically with a symbolic bid like a pint of beer, she was free from her previous husband, even if technically not divorced under law. The practice held more social than legal weight. You still have bad nights. Dreams where you're back on the crate, halter tight, voice stolen. Dreams where the crowd laughs louder and no one bids. Dreams where even Thomas turns his back. But then you wake up to a quiet cottage and warm coals and tea that isn't burnt. And somehow it's enough. And Thomas, he keeps his word. He doesn't ask, he doesn't expect. He fixes the roof when it leaks. He brings home scraps for soup, once. He even buys you a new comb. Your old one's missing teeth, he mutters, like the comb insulted his craftsmanship. You accept it without thanks, but you use it daily. Here's your fringe tidbit in rare accounts. A wife was sold more than once, passed from man to man, either by accident, desperation, or demand. One such woman, it said, eventually set the price herself, 2 shillings, she declared, and I don't come with opinions. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect satire or the gritty flexibility of a system that ignored the powerless. On Sundays, you sit by the door and sew. You don't go to church, not yet. That feels too public, too symbolic. But you let the light hit your face and you listen to the bells. You imagine what your life might look like years from now. Gray hair, aching knees, still stitching, still watching dust float in sunbeams. You're not a cautionary tale. You're not a romance. You're not a scandal anymore. You're just still here. And in 18th century England, that's something. You glance at the rope on the mantel, still folded, still present, but no longer a threat. It's just a relic now, like a shoe you've outgrown, or a name you no longer need. Work doesn't stop, even when your name has become a market fable in 18th century England. Time off is a rumor, and comfort is a luxury someone else invented. You rise with the sun and often before it. Not because you're virtuous, but because the firewood isn't going to chop itself, and the soup won't stir unless you prod it like a stubborn mule. Thomas heads off to his barrels. The thud of his mallet becomes a metronome in your days. You listen for it without realizing. The routine is simple, if unforgiving. Tend the hearth. Sweep the ash. Boil the wash. Peel the roots. You find an odd comfort in how mechanical it is. At least you know what comes next. Here's your mainstream historical fact for lower-class English women in the 1700s. Labor was constant and divided without kindness. You were a housekeeper, laundress, midwife, mother, and sometimes field hand, all before sundown. The average woman rose before dawn and worked well into the evening, often beside her husband or children. With no compensation beyond survival, you work until your fingers swell, then work more. On rainy days, the thatched roof leaks into a bucket beside the hearth. You dump it out, muttering about the hole. Thomas promises to fix it. He forgets. You don't remind him this, too, is a form of peace. Children scurry in and out of neighbors' homes like mice in breeches. You watch them from the stoop, remembering your own younger years, if younger can apply to a time when you were already cooking at 10 and carrying water by 12. Childhood here ends as soon as your fingers can grip a scrub brush. There's a boy down the lane who tries to race carts. He always loses, always grins. Once, he asks you why you don't have any children. You shrug. Maybe I was meant for silence, not lullabies. He doesn't understand, but offers you a carrot anyway. You take it. Here's your fringe tidbit. Records show that some sold wives went on to live quietly, working side by side with their new owners. But there are accounts often whispered of women disappearing after the sale, possibly choosing anonymity over marriage again. Historians still argue whether wife sales offered opportunity or merely swapped one captor for another with a better smile. Every so often, someone offers you lighter work, sewing for the squire's daughter, mending at the parson's home. You decline. You'd rather scrub soot from your own hearth than stitch ruffles for someone who looks at you like you're a cautionary poem. Thomas doesn't ask you to stop, doesn't tell you to rest. But sometimes when you're bent over the bucket, he sets down his tools, rolls up his sleeves, and helps. No speech, no applause, just water sloshing and something like quiet respect filling the room. You wipe your hands on your apron and pretend not to notice. Here's what they never tell you about labor. The hardest part isn't the aching joints or the raw skin or the permanent smell of cabbage in your hair. It's doing all of that with a memory of a rope around your waist and an audience that treated your life like street theater. But you keep working. Not because you must, but because in the small rhythm of daily toil, you find the thing that no sale could take, your own stubborn pulse. The sky plays tricks on you now. In spring, it teases warmth, then spits sleet like a drunk with bad aim. By summer, the sun blisters your shoulders as you hang laundry that never dries. In winter, the wind rattles your teeth and makes your bones feel like bad scaffolding. You've started rating mornings by how many toes you can feel. 3 out of 10 today, that's practically luxury. Weather in this part of England isn't a conversation starter, it's a daily opponent. You don't just endure it, you negotiate, plead, curse, and sometimes lose. The roof always leaks in the exact spot where the bed sits. You've tried moving the bed, now the rain just finds you slower. Here's your mainstream historical fact for working-class families in the 18th century. There was no insulation, no reliable heating, and no real seasonal wardrobe. Most houses were built with mud walls and thatched roofs, offering little protection against the elements. If it rained, you were wet. If it snowed, you were frozen. And if it got too hot, well, you opened the same window the rats used. Your clothes are made of wool. Not the nice kind, more like grazed a fence and lost wool. Scratchy, heavy when wet, and always, always damp. You wear the same shift all year. You patch it with bits from an old apron. The sleeves don't match anymore. The wind doesn't care. Shoes are another thing entirely. You own one pair. They were your mother's, then yours, then patched with the leather of an old belt. They make your feet ache, but going barefoot makes them bleed. Your solution alternate between suffering and infection when summer finally comes. It doesn't bring relief, just a new kind of misery. The air thickens. Flies arrive. You wake up sweating through your bedding, which now smells like boiled onions and regret. You'd open the windows more, but mosquitoes have unionized. Thomas builds a small bench outside. Thought you might want air. He says you sit on it once. Then a bee lands on your hand, and you spend 10 minutes screaming like you're under siege. Still, it's the nicest thing anyone's built for you since, well, ever. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some wives were sold in winter, and the buyers insisted on including the wife's only cloak in the deal, leading to post-sale disputes. In at least one account, a husband tried to charge extra for weatherproofing. Historians still argue whether this was legal creativity or just peak pettiness. Rain isn't romantic when it drips onto your nose at 3 a.m. You learn to sleep with a bucket nearby. You name it Gerald. He's the most dependable man in your life after Thomas. The worst, though, is autumn. Not because it's the coldest or hottest, but because it pretends to be both. You leave the house in a shawl, come home sunburned. The weather changes faster than gossip, and both will ruin your day. You stop expecting comfort from the world, but you start finding it in strange places. A warm rock near the door, a cup of tea that's still hot when you drink it. Thomas remembering to cover the fire at night so you don't wake up in an icebox. You're not thriving, you're not flourishing, but you are adapting. And in a century like this, that's its own kind of miracle, water. The thing you need most, fear often, and trust least in your world. It's a gamble in every cup. Rivers look inviting until you remember they double as communal laundromats. Sewers and livestock baths. The well near the church tastes like pennies and guilt. You drink from it anyway. Boil when you can, pray when you can't. Clean water is a theory, a rumor, a privilege found only in books written by people who've never had to catch rain in a chamber pot and bathing. That's not cleanliness, it's controversy. Here's your mainstream historical fact in 18th century England. The prevailing medical wisdom believed that warm water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Bathing too frequently was considered not only unnecessary but downright dangerous. Most people avoided full baths altogether and instead settled for wiping the important bits with a damp cloth if that cloth wasn't already being used to swat flies. You bathe once every month, if the weather's forgiving and your courage holds. The process is biblical. Heating the water takes hours. Privacy is impossible, and the tin tub is too small for anyone with dreams. Still, you strip, you soak, and you shiver. The water greets your skin like a slap. You hiss, you curse, you endure. Thomas knocks once. Do you need more water? You don't answer, but he brings it anyway. The bath never feels luxurious. It feels like an apology, one that's 3 weeks late and slightly sour. But afterward, wrapped in your only dry shift, skin slightly pink and steaming, you almost believe you're clean. Almost. Here's your fringe tidbit in some towns. Public bathhouses still operated, mostly used by sailors, drunks, and the desperate. But for married women, too risky. A visit could spark rumors faster than adultery. One woman reportedly lost her job as a cook after someone claimed she washed too freely. Historians still argue whether this fear of bathing was rooted in science or simply a culture too broke to afford soap. Speaking of soap, yours is homemade. Lard, ash, a prayer. It smells like regret and pebbles. Sometimes it works, sometimes it burns. You use it sparingly. You don't have enough skin to keep losing layers. Water is also for laundry, though that's more wish than action. You boil what you can in a soot-black pot and beat it against a flat stone. If a stain doesn't come out, it becomes part of the shirt's identity. One of your aprons has what looks like a permanent portrait of a turnip. You've named it Malcolm. Drinking water is always an ordeal. The ale is safer, even if it dulls your thoughts. Children drink it. Old women stir soup with it. And when a well runs dry, the whole street feels like someone died. You once saw a man scoop river water with a hat. He hasn't been seen since. Somehow, despite all this, you remain. Your body adjusts, your stomach hardens, your expectations crumble and rebuild. Smaller and sharper, you don't need clear water or warm baths anymore. You need just enough not to die. One morning, you wake to rain pounding the roof like it's demanding entry. You place Gerald the bucket under the familiar leak and crawl back into bed. You listen to the drops, count them like sins, and for once, instead of annoyance, you feel gratitude. Because in your world, the difference between comfort and catastrophe might just be a bucket in the right place. Wind down final 200 words, the rain slows, fading to a whisper. You lie there, eyes closed, muscles soft. The fire flickers gently in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls that no longer feel like prison bars. Just boards and stone humble, but yours. Thomas breathes evenly on the floor nearby, the old rug wrapped around him like a makeshift cocoon. You don't speak, there's no need. Silence, for once, isn't heavy, it's restful. The rope on the mantel still sits, gathering dust like a chapter long closed but never fully forgotten. Outside, the wind hushes the trees. The cottage creaks its lullaby. You shift beneath the blanket. the one with more patches than fabric, and pull it higher. Tomorrow will bring more mud, more buckets, more staring eyes. But for now, the air is cool, the night is kind. And you're still here, still breathing, still whole. And in a world that tried to sell your name, your body, and your worth, you've reclaimed every inch of it. Sleep now. No halters, no auctions. Only breath, warmth, and the quiet power of surviving. Hey guys, tonight we drift downstream, right into the silvery morning mist of a world where history and myth forgot to separate their laundry. You're not wearing modern pajamas. You're draped in embroidered silk that weighs more than your body and smells faintly of lotus and political obligation. The floor is packed earth. Your pillow is a sack of rice husks. And you're in a bamboo hut built beside a river that gurgles like it knows too much. You just woke up in ancient southern China, in a village so old no one remembers who built it, but everyone agrees it's sacred because something once emerged from the water and didn't die immediately. Good news, you're a royal. Bad news, today is your wedding day and your groom, he has a shell. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I like knowing where my time travelers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning begins with drums that sound like someone dropped a wooden bowl down a cliff. They've been beating since sunrise because apparently, that's what celebration sounds like when you have limited percussion and unlimited fish. You sit upright on your mat, your spine already regretting the day. Your hair has been combed into painful obedience. An older woman with exactly 3 teeth paints your lips with crushed berries and mutters that the stars are favorable today. Though the frogs disagreed, you wonder if anyone's asked the groom. They haven't. Because he's not a man. He's not even a metaphor. He's a golden turtle. And somehow, everyone's just fine with that. Here's your mainstream historical fact: in many East Asian cultures, especially during early dynastic periods, turtles symbolized longevity, wisdom, and divine order. They were believed to carry the world on their backs. Some origin myths, like that of Lac Long Quan in Vietnamese lore, where this story likely branches, tangle rulers and gods with animal forms. The divine didn't always come in the shape you'd hope for, or with legs. Outside, the villagers bow low. They've decorated the path with lotus petals and sticks of incense so thick they make your eyes water before you step into the smoke. Someone ties red thread to your wrist. Someone else hands you a gourd with water you're not allowed to drink yet. Ceremony first, hydration later. You're led to the riverbank. There's a platform, on it a priest, a scroll, and yes, right on cue, a turtle the size of a washing basket, glowing faintly gold. He blinks at you twice, then bows and speaks, not with his mouth, which stays distinctly turtle-shaped, but through what feels like a breeze inside your skull. "Princess," the voice says, your beauty ripples like a moon's reflection. You wonder if he practices these lines with the fish. Your father clears his throat. He looks extremely pleased. This marriage will bring balance, harmony, and probably fewer floods. The shaman chants. The turtle responds in thunder. You repeat a vow you don't understand. Everyone claps. You are now married to a god who lives underwater and has no furniture. Here's your fringe detail in some mythic accounts tied to Lac Long Quan's lineage. Royal unions with animal or dragon spirits weren't symbolic, they were literal. These tales served as genealogical blueprints, justifying the divine right of kings through magical ancestry. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual metaphor or a very elaborate way to say, "Our ruler is different, don't question it." You're led to a boat carved with dragons. The villagers cheer, you wave. The turtle hops in beside you gracefully, for someone with flippers, and the boat moves without oars. Downstream you go into the mist, toward a palace made of coral and myth, and the wedding feast. Well, let's just say the menu features kelp in more varieties than you thought existed. Your new husband eats a snail and smiles. You pretend not to mind. The boat drifts silently, as if pulled by threads no one can see, threads spun by myth, stitched into water. You sit beside your new husband, a golden turtle who hums without opening his mouth, radiates the confidence of a minor river deity, and doesn't seem at all fazed that his new bride looks like she wants to jump overboard. You try to act serene, which is difficult when your groom has flippers and your feet are starting to go numb from sitting too politely on woven mats. The villagers fade into mist behind you. Ahead, only fog and that unsettling sense that your destiny now involves amphibians. Your hair is too heavy, your stomach too quiet. You skipped breakfast, a decision you now regret deeply because no one told you how long the ceremonial glide into marital enlightenment would take. You steal a glance at him, the turtle, and find him looking forward, or possibly downward. It's hard to read facial expressions when your husband doesn't have eyebrows. Here's your mainstream historical fact arranged. Marriages among royalty were almost never about love. They were treaties with rings. Political chess wrapped in silk. Daughters were not daughters, they were leverage. And marrying off a royal girl to a sea deity, or in this case, a turtle-shaped river spirit, wasn't strange. It was smart. Secure divine favor, protect crops, reduce storms. Just don't ask the girl how she feels about cold feet, literally and figuratively. The fog parts. A palace emerges. Not brick and mortar, but scales and light. Coral towers twist like frozen smoke. The walls shimmer with trapped sunlight. It's beautiful and deeply impractical. You are fairly certain nothing here has a roof or stairs. You step off the boat and instantly feel the change. The ground is soft, springy, possibly made of moss or very well-trained jellyfish. You're not sure. Your husband glides beside you. "Welcome home," he says inside your head. Your head declines to respond. Here's your fringe detail in Southern Chinese and Vietnamese folklore. The golden turtle god is sometimes said to have created islands by depositing magical stones or using his back as temporary land. This spirit, often named Kim Kui, appears in tales to assist kings and restore justice. Historians still argue whether the turtle was an ancient symbol of political legitimacy or just an aquatic mascot with unusually good timing. The wedding chamber is damp. That's your first impression. It glistens. The walls breathe. There's a bed of pearls that looks more decorative than restful. And in the center of the ceiling, a skylight made of living jellyfish. They pulse with light like sleepy stars. You lie down, dressed in more fabric than sense. Your husband coils beside you, not in a creepy way, in an "I've done this before" way, which is somehow worse. He says nothing. You say nothing. The silence stretches across the room and down through the coral floor. Eventually you fall asleep, not because you feel safe, but because the exhaustion of being symbolic is heavier than your ceremonial hairpins. You dream of frogs, thousands of them, all whispering it could have been worse. When you wake, you are married, underwater, and still unsure how consent factors into conversations with magical reptiles. The ceiling pulses faintly with jellyfish glow, and the walls continue to sweat. There is no sun here, just a strange gold-blue light that seeps through the palace like time doesn't apply. Your clothes have dried, somehow, though you're not entirely sure how they got wet in the first place. You're still wearing the ceremonial silk. A servant, a fish spirit floats silently into the room and bows. You're handed a plate of something gelatinous and shimmering. You nod politely and wait for it to stop moving before eating. Across the table, there's a table now, carved from mother of pearl, and just slightly too low your husband watches you. Still in turtle form, still glowing, still very, very pleased with himself. "This is your realm now," he says. "Oh, you were hoping for how did you sleep, but sure, realm talk it is." He glides again, not walks, glides toward a large shell-shaped throne and sits. It molds to his shape like it's done this before. You sit across from him on a sponge cushion that collapses under your weight, as if even the furniture knows this isn't your story. Here's your mainstream historical fact in many origin myths from Vietnam and southern China. Animal deities were considered intermediaries between humans and nature. The golden turtle Kim Kui is one of the most enduring, sometimes aiding kings with magical swords, other times giving advice in the form of riddles. These spirits were respected, feared, and often married into. In stories, it's never weird. In reality, you're starting to question your family's judgment. The turtle speaks again. This union brings peace between realms. You try to nod like that means something to you. You're 19. You wanted a horse. You got diplomacy by shellfish. But the people above believe this marriage has changed everything. There hasn't been a flood in weeks. Fishermen say the river smiles now. Your name is sung with reverence. You are, apparently, a water goddess. You, who still think kelp smells like regret. A grand banquet is arranged. Creatures arrive, some with legs, some without. A crab plays the zither. An octopus waves rhythmically. You're served a delicacy described as eel dreams folded in moon jelly. You miss dumplings. You miss warmth. You miss speaking out loud and not hearing the reply inside your skull. Your husband, do we call him that, gives a speech. It includes phrases like sacred lineage and harmony of shell and blood. Everyone claps. A starfish throws confetti. You eat something that might be sea cucumber. You chew it slowly and try not to cry. Here's your fringe detail. Some folktales record that human consorts to water spirits could never return fully to land. If they tried, their memory faded, or the rivers rose in protest. Historians still argue whether these motifs were warnings against abandoning one's duty, or metaphors for how marriage erases women's identities under the tide of expectation. Later, when the guests have drifted away and the jellyfish lights dim, he speaks again. I know you are uncertain. That's one way to phrase it. But the river chose you. The line must continue. You nod, because saying no to a god is hard when you're already living in his house. You close your eyes. You hear water whisper through coral veins. You dream of land, of dust, of voices spoken aloud, not from within, and of one very large turtle, whispering promises he believes are gifts but sound an awful lot like instructions. You adjust to palace life the way a fish might adjust to a bicycle, which is to say awkwardly, and with more flailing than grace. The floors are always damp, not wet, just damp, like they've never been introduced to the concept of dry. Every step is a soft squish. You've stopped wondering what's under the rugs. It's probably sentient. You're given attendants. They don't speak. They float. Occasionally they hum, but it might just be their gills. You're never quite sure if they're people enchanted into fish or fish enchanted into people or something in between. One of them has eyebrows. You trust her the most. Your schedule is simple. Rise at what passes for dawn measured by bioluminescent algae. Eat something vaguely crunchy and always slightly translucent. Then sit in the hall of aquatic harmony and wave at passing river spirits. Sometimes you nod solemnly. Sometimes you fall asleep sitting up and no one seems to mind. Here's your mainstream historical fact in imperial-era folklore across East and Southeast Asia. Undersea palaces were symbolic of spiritual purity, timeless, changeless, immune to the corruption of mortal politics. These realms often functioned as resting places for favored humans or realms of reward. But they also reflected the social expectations of the time, and even underwater, the bride had duties. Your new home is vast. It glows in different shades depending on the mood of the water, sometimes deep emerald, sometimes eerie sapphire. Occasionally the walls flash red, though you're told not to worry about that. Just the tide remembering something upsetting. Your husband says, you find a garden. It's made entirely of swaying seagrass and coral shaped like peonies. There's no dirt, just soft golden sand that glimmers when you step across it barefoot. You sit there often, alone. The turtle never joins you in the garden. He says it's yours. You plant a rock and pretend it will bloom. It doesn't, but you keep watering it anyway. He visits nightly, gliding into your chamber like a polite omen. You talk about the village, the river, your dreams. He listens with the fixed serenity of someone who's either incredibly wise or completely lost. You mention missing trees. He offers you seaweed shaped like branches. You say you miss warmth. He glows slightly brighter. You miss people. Real people. Ones who breathe air and tell jokes badly and trip over their own feet. He replies, you are not alone, which is true, but also not. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some oral traditions claim that brides of divine or magical beings gradually changed over time, growing gills, developing translucent skin, losing memories of land. Historians still argue whether these motifs were tragic metaphors for cultural assimilation or simply eerie bedtime stories to discourage daughters from wandering too close to rivers. You start writing in sand with your finger, just simple things: your name, the name of your sister, a drawing of a tree. The next day, it's gone, washed away. You keep writing anyway. One morning, a gift appears at your door. It's a mirror, but the reflection is blurry, as if water still clings to your face even when you're dry. Your eyes look too large, your lips too pale. You stare at yourself for a long time and wonder, am I changing? You tap the glass. It ripples, then clears. And there you are, still you, mostly. He arrives at your side. Do you miss your people? He asks. Yes, you say without thinking. I will arrange a visit. And just like that, the walls pulse a new color violet and servants begin packing. He's letting you return. Not forever, of course. Just for now. Because even golden turtles know you can take the girl out of the village. But sometimes, you have to let her walk the dirt before she forgets what it felt like. You expect a chariot of dolphins or a shimmering sea portal. You get a boat, a plain wooden boat with moss between the boards and a paddle carved from driftwood. But it floats and it moves, and that's already more magic than most things you remember from life on land. You sit in the boat clutching a bundle of kelp-wrapped gifts and try not to think too hard about what your feet look like. You're still human, mostly, but the skin around your ankles has taken on a sort of permanent shimmer, and when you bend your head too quickly, you swear you can hear salt water sloshing inside. He doesn't come with you. He watches from the shore, a silhouette of golden shell and timeless calm. Go, he says. They'll sing your name, which is always a dangerous promise. The mist thickens as the boat slides upriver. You remember this mist. It once carried voices and fireflies. It now feels like a soft veil you're passing through backward in time. Sideways through memory, when the boat bumps against the dock. You step out with the awkward stiffness of someone who hasn't walked on dirt in too long. The villagers stare. Of course they do. You were a princess, then a bride, then a myth. Now you're standing barefoot in front of the market stalls, holding kelp like it's a bouquet. Here's your mainstream historical fact in folklore across Asia. The return of a divine or semi-divine bride was often symbolic of harmony restored or warnings unheeded. These stories reflected communal values, often turning personal tales into larger metaphors. The bride was never just a person. She was weather, fertility, balance, debt. You are offered a seat. You decline. Sitting would feel too permanent. They ask if you are hungry. You are. But the thought of food that doesn't taste like brine confuses your tongue. Still, you eat a yam, a rice cake, a plum so sweet it makes your teeth ache. You close your eyes and chew. No seaweed, no crunch of invisible fish bits, just dirt-grown fruit and the faint taste of soot from a wood fire. You might cry, but the air is too dry to bother. They ask where you've been. You say with him. They nod. Like that explains everything. It does, sort of. You visit your old house. It's smaller than you remember. The thatch is frayed. The floor creaks. There's a chicken living where your sister once slept. But the air smells of sandalwood and home. You sleep on a mat that isn't damp. You wake up to a rooster instead of tidal pressure. Your dreams are quieter, less glowing. And yet, you start to miss him. Not like romance. Not like longing. More like an itch behind the ribs when something's out of place. Because love isn't always poetry. Sometimes it's habits. Sometimes it's knowing which silence is yours. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some versions of the turtle princess myth say the bride began hearing the river whisper to her long after returning to land, calling her back, pulling her dreams toward the tide. Historians still argue whether these were expressions of grief or metaphors for cultural exile that never quite resolved. On the third morning, you bathe in the stream. You touch the water and it pulses. You see golden light in the reflection, not your face, but something waiting behind it. You tell no one. That night, you sit by the fire with a bowl of rice in your lap and realize that the villagers have stopped watching you. You've become ordinary again. And somehow that stings more than the salt ever did. You whisper into the dark. Are you still listening? And from far, far away, something ripples once, which is either the river answering or your heart remembering how you don't remember deciding to go back. It just happens. One moment, you're helping a child braid lotus stems into rings. The next, your hands are slippery with mist and the river is rising again, not fast, not flooding, just high enough to whisper, the kind of whisper that isn't asking, the kind that sounds like it's time. You climb into the boat, no one stops you, no one even speaks, they just bow, as if this was always the plan. As if girls made of water and land never really stay where they start. The golden turtle waits at the bend. Of course he does. He says nothing as you return. His eyes glimmer with the knowing of someone who has waited longer than you've been alive. You nod, that's enough, that's everything. Back in the palace. The coral still curves like poetry, and the jellyfish lamps blink like sleepy guards. The servants hum. Your room smells the same salt, silk, and something almost like memory. But it's not the same anymore. Because now your body carries dust, your hair remembers wind, your feet itch for roots. And the palace notices there are new echoes. On the third day you feel different. Not sick, not sad, just heavier, which is strange, considering you haven't aged a day. Then you know. You're pregnant. Your husband, the turtle, the god, the not-quite man glows with what might be joy or surprise or possibly both. His flippers flex, he blinks twice. It will be a strong child, he says, of both water and sky. You don't know if he means that poetically or literally, and honestly, you don't ask, because you've accepted that in this palace. Metaphors and reality hold hands under the table. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many foundational myths, children born from human divine unions were believed to carry extraordinary power or purpose. These offspring became ancestors of nations, founders of dynasties or mediators between realms. The Lac Long Quan myth, central to Vietnamese heritage, speaks of a dragon lord and a fairy mother whose children populate the land and sea divided, but forever connected. You give birth quietly. No screaming, no sweating, just pressure like a rising tide and a flash of golden light. The child cries, loud, human lungs, human eyes, webbed toes. You hold him close. He stops crying. Then he glows. Here's your fringe tidbit in some esoteric retellings. The firstborn child of the Golden Turtle Union was said to speak in full sentences by the age of 3 months. Others claim he never spoke, but his tears made pearls. Historians still argue whether these are divine metaphors or ancient exaggerations typical of early court storytellers trying to impress bored emperors. The days blur. You feed him on milk that tastes slightly like sea foam. You sing songs you barely remember from land. You teach him the words for fish, sky, leaf, dust. He listens, he learns, he grows, and he asks too soon, too cleverly, "Why don't we live where you're from?" You look at his father. The golden turtle says nothing, but his glow dims. You tell your son stories of the village, of plum trees, of fires that crackle instead of pulse. You teach him how to draw with driftwood, how to shape words from silence, how to balance when standing in two worlds, because that's what he is now. Both, not split, not lost, just both. And you're not the same girl who feared flippers and slept on pearl beds like they were coffins. You're not quite divine, not quite dust, but you're a mother now, and somehow that makes you more real than you've ever been. It starts with the tides acting strangely, coming in too early, Retreating without warning, the fish begin to vanish. The servants move with quiet urgency. The jellyfish lanterns flicker as though they're receiving bad news in Morse code. He tells you at twilight, "I must go." You look up from your child, who's drawing spirals into the sand with a coral shard. Go where? To the deeper sea. There's no ceremony, no prophecy, just a god saying goodbye in the same voice he once used to offer you seaweed tea. You ask, "Will you return?" "I will watch." You don't ask from where, because you already know. The deep is where gods go when they've done their part, when the tide no longer needs their name. He's not vanishing. He's becoming something else, something larger, less visible. "Take care of him," he says, nodding toward your son. You nod back, because tears are useless underwater. And then he leaves, just like that. No splash, no parting of seas, just absence. Here's your mainstream historical fact in many ancient myths, especially Southeast Asian ones. Divine husbands often departed after their children were born. This mirrored real-world practices of royal consorts being retired or relocated after fulfilling dynastic duties. The deity's departure marked both an ending and a beginning, a symbolic handing over of the world. You try not to resent him. After all, you always knew this wasn't permanent. You try not to panic. After all, you've become capable. But there are quiet hours between your son's dreams and the jellyfish pulses when the silence stretches too long. And you say his name just to feel it in the water. And sometimes it answers back, not with words, with warmth. A tide that cradles the walls gently. A ripple that crosses the floor like a lullaby. A seashell delivered silently to your pillow. You pretend not to notice, but you always do. Here's your fringe tidbit. In lesser-known versions of the myth, the golden turtle does not die but transforms into the riverbed itself, sleeping beneath his family for all time. Historians still argue whether this ending was meant to soften the story or reinforce the theme of eternal protection disguised as absence. Your son grows fast. He asks questions like a scholar and runs like a storm. He wants to know why he glows when angry. You don't have answers, but you hug him tightly anyway and tell him. Because you're special. It's the same lie every mother tells. Yours just happens to be slightly more literal. Some days, you both walk the palace halls in silence. Other days, you chase each other through tunnels lined with blue moss and shrieking eels. It's domestic. It's absurd. It's yours. You speak to the river more often now, not to summon him, just to check in. The way people write letters they never mail. The way people leave a space at the table for someone who's never on time. You begin writing a book in the sand. It vanishes each day, but you keep at it. One chapter at a time. The story of how love isn't always two people holding hands. Sometimes, it's one holding the door while the other walks into legend. The years, if you can call them that down here, pass without calendar or clock. Your son is taller now, still glowing though less erratically and still asking questions with sharp edges. Why don't I have a shell? Will I ever live on land? Did you love him? You answer some, you dodge others. You don't lie, not exactly. You just let silence do most of the talking. He becomes curious about the surface, the villages, the stories you tell of birds and bread, and wind that doesn't come from a tide. One day, he brings you a scroll he found deep in the coral library, a map, roughly drawn, marked with mountains and something labeled Father's Shore. You smile and nod like it's a game. It is, of course, until it isn't, because the next morning he's gone. No note, no glowing trail, just a whisper in the current, like laughter held underwater. You panic quietly, because you've learned that screaming in an aquatic palace accomplishes nothing but echo. You send word. You dispatch fish that carry folded scraps of motherly terror disguised as urgent blessings. You wait. For 3 days, then he returns, sunburned, breathless, grinning like a boy who just outran a dragon. He says, "I saw land, Mother." You sit down very slowly and tell your heart to behave. He continues, "I want to live there." Of course he does. Of course. Here's your mainstream historical fact in the foundational Lac Long Quan myth. The divine couple, often portrayed as a dragon lord and a fairy queen, eventually part ways, dividing their 100 children evenly. 50 go with the mother to the mountains. 50 go with the father to the sea. This symbolic division represented the diversity of the Vietnamese people, part land, part water, but all kin. You always knew this day would come. You just didn't expect it to feel like you were dissolving. You pack his things: kelp-wrapped dried fruit, a stone that glows when held tight, a single feather you don't remember ever owning. He hugs you like he might not return. You hug him like he must. Here's your fringe tidbit. In one variation of the tale, the sea children who went to land left behind a pearl in the palace garden, one that grew warmer every time their descendants thrived. Historians still argue whether this detail was metaphorical, allegorical, or just folklore's way of adding a glow-in-the-dark moral. The morning of his departure, the palace dims, not out of grief, just adjustment. Even jellyfish understand departure. You walk him to the edge of the tide where a boat waits, not conjured, not blessed, just wooden and old. He climbs in. He doesn't cry, you don't wave, because waving feels like a period, and you're not ready for this sentence to end. He disappears into the mist. The same mist you emerged from all those years ago. The circle doesn't close, it softens like sand around a footprint. You return to the garden. You plant another rock and wait, because gods leave, children leave. Even rivers change course, but mothers wait. It's quieter now. The palace no longer hums with footfalls or laughter. Just the soft rhythm of currents brushing coral and the occasional yawn of a sleepy clam. You walk the halls without hurry. You sit in the garden longer. Even the kelp seems to sway slower, as though in mourning, or more likely in total indifference. You keep busy in small, stubborn ways. You polish the pearl tiles, even though no one visits. You rearrange your shells. You tell stories aloud, knowing no one is there to hear them except the river itself, and maybe that's the point. You no longer need listeners to make something true. The rock you planted months ago remains just that, a rock. But it's a familiar one now. It's cracked in a pleasant, reliable pattern. You trace it with your finger, like checking a scar that no longer hurts but never quite forgets how. Some nights you dream of dust, not magical mist or perfumed steam, but plain, itchy, wind-blown dust, land dreams in them. You walk barefoot on stone steps and your son calls your name from a hilltop. You never reach him, but he's always smiling. You wake with wet cheeks, though you're not sure if it's tears or just sea spray. Here's your mainstream historical fact in ancient myth cycles. Retired or transformed figures like queens, river brides, or god spouses often lived out the rest of their days in sacred seclusion. They weren't forgotten, but neither were they fully remembered. They became fixtures in their landscape, half memory, half monument. One day a turtle appears, not golden, not glowing, just turtle. He waddles into your garden, sneezes on a shell, and blinks at you. You nod. Welcome, you say. He doesn't reply, but he stays. You name him Echo. He eats too much. He breaks 3 bowls. He digs up your rock. But he listens when you talk, and when you cry, and when you sing. You sing more now. Old songs, nonsense songs, lullabies you once thought lost. They echo oddly against the coral walls. Not haunting, just hollow. Like empty rooms that know they once mattered. Then one afternoon, soft current, sleepy palace, Echo snoring under a mushroom, something taps against the garden gate. You expect a fish. You get a foot. A boy, no. A man now stands there, skin sun-darkened, cloak sea-damp, holding a bag shaped like a promise. Mother, he says, and your heart doesn't know whether to leap or curl up and hide. You don't run. You don't faint. You walk to him, and he holds you. Tighter than you thought water would allow. I missed you, he says. You laugh. Just once, I never left. And just like that, you are no longer a forgotten bride of myth. You are a mother with her son. And that finally feels like enough. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some rare versions of the tale say the river bride lived 1,000 years and taught her descendants how to listen to tides. Others claim she was seen walking on the surface of the water during moonlit nights. Historians still argue whether these sightings were hallucinations or hope. You grow older now, truly older, not immortal, just slower. Your hair loses its glow, your fingers curl with age. You move like seaweed in still water, graceful, but only if you don't rush. You sleep more, dream less. But when you do dream, it's of laughter echoing through halls, of coral gardens blooming, and of golden light that once said, "Welcome home." And in the mornings, you wake with peace curled beside you like a soft shell. You don't ask for more, because you've finally learned enough can be everything. Wind down 200 words, and now, as the jellyfish lights dim and the water settles around the quiet palace, let your breath slow with it. Let the story melt like mist on a warm tide. Let your bones sink deeper into the calm. You've traveled far tonight, not through geography, but through memory and myth, through longing and letting go, through a palace made of shimmer and sorrow, through the shape of silence, the sound of footsteps that never echo quite the same way twice. You've sat beside a turtle god, watched a sun sail away and felt time stretch in both directions, and now nothing needs to happen. Just rest. No golden lights, no prophecies, just you, curled up in your own story, your own breath. You're not waiting anymore. You're simply here, and here is enough. So let the water fade, let the ripples stop, let the garden sleep, and let yourself drift, soft and slow, into dreams that know how to hold you. Good night. Hey guys, tonight we head somewhere dim, colder than any cave, wetter than regret, and smaller than your average pantry. You're in 14th century Scotland, land of castles, mist, and husbands with too much authority and far too few emotional coping skills. You just woke up on the bed that doesn't deserve to be called that. It's straw, technically. Mostly it's mold and straw's emotionally unavailable cousin. Mildew. A stone wall curves around you like a hug from someone who's forgotten what hugs are for. There's a window, if you can call it that. More like a square hole where wind enters with enthusiasm and leaves its muddy footprints on your bones. You are not in a palace. You are not in a dungeon. You are in something in between a noblewoman's prison, and you have been here for quite some time. You don't know exactly how long because no one thought to give you a calendar, or a clock, or food that didn't try to walk away first. But your joints know, your knees say 10 years. Your spine whispers 15, your heart doesn't keep count anymore. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so is your husband. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and local time down in the comments, especially if you're currently in a place where you don't need permission from a man to leave a room. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your name doesn't matter much in here. Out there, maybe you were lady something of somewhere. You had a dowry and a dress and a voice. In here, you're mostly ribs and memory. You wake up, same as every morning, with the cold curled around your spine like a pet, one eye crusted shut, the other adjusting to light that's not really light, more like a polite gray suggestion. There's a rat near your foot, possibly the same one from yesterday, possibly your closest friend now. You don't scream. You stopped screaming in year 2. You pull your cloak tighter, though it stopped warming you 3 winters ago. The air smells like wet stone, old sweat, and something sweet and sinister, probably decay. You wonder, briefly, if it's yours. Now here's your historical fact in medieval Scotland. Noblemen could and did imprison their wives for moral offenses, including suspected infidelity, defiance, or just inconvenience. There wasn't a clear appeals process, no courtroom drama, just door shut. Woman gone if the husband was powerful. No one asked where she went. If he was petty, he visited just to gloat. Your husband. He was ambitious, cold, and meticulous, the kind of man who pronounces every syllable in consequence. The kind of man who thinks silence is more painful than shouting. The kind of man who smiled when he locked the door. Historians still argue whether such imprisonments were rare abuses or quietly tolerated practices among the nobility. Records are inconsistent. Women disappear from ledgers, reappear in wills, or not at all. You didn't commit a crime. Not unless you count wearing color during Lent or laughing too loud at court. You were married off young, as most noblewomen were. Part alliance, part asset, part warm body for future heirs. You fulfilled your duties until he said you didn't. You remember the moment he snapped? A look. A whispered conversation you weren't meant to hear. A door that didn't open the next morning. And then 30 years. In this room, the same four walls. The same cough that won't leave. The same patch of lichen you named Elspeth because it's nice to have someone to talk to. The same voice in your head that still says this is temporary, even though it absolutely isn't. You used to cry, then you stopped. You used to count the days, then the days stopped counting back. And now you wake, stretch your joints, greet the rat, and whisper good morning to Elspeth, because that's what your life is now. The cell is not a dungeon. Strictly speaking, dungeons, after all, come with chains and drama. Yours is subtler. It's what nobility might call discreet confinement, a stone chamber tucked into the back end of a forgotten tower, high enough that you don't hear the street, low enough that the sun forgets to visit. You live with shadows that never change shape. They have names. One of them is called afternoon, though you've never seen proof it exists. The floor is stone so hard your hips remember every winter. When it rains, puddles bloom in the corners like little miserable kingdoms. The straw mattress is flattened and sour. It's replaced once every... Who knows? You once dreamed of counting thatched layers like rings in a tree. Then you remembered trees live outdoors. There is one window. It's small and covered with iron bars thick enough to survive a siege. If you stand on your tiptoes and tilt your head just right, you can see a sliver of sky. You did this daily, once, then weekly. Now only when you need to prove to yourself that it's still there, that you're still here. No fire, no chimney, just the vague luxury of being technically above ground. The dampness comes in through the stone itself. Cold that isn't just a temperature, but a philosophy. It settles into your bones like it has a lease. Your bedclothes, a woolen cloak that used to be green. Now it's the color of despair mixed with dust. You tuck it around you like memory. Sometimes, you imagine what it was like to wear this cloak upright, walking through a hall, your feet echoing on polished stone. That echo is gone now. You walk like someone trying not to disturb ghosts. Here's your mainstream historical fact: medieval noblewomen, even those of status, had no legal independence. Their husbands controlled their land, finances, and physical freedom. If a husband deemed his wife disobedient or simply politically inconvenient, he could isolate her indefinitely under the guise of domestic discipline. There were no trials, only closed doors. You have a chamber pot in one corner. It's emptied occasionally by servants who never meet your eyes. You used to try speaking to them. Once you asked one his name, he flinched like you'd cursed him. After that, you stopped asking. The rats are less shy. You name them things like Robert, Agnes, or on wild days, Queen Margaret. You imagine them with titles, roles, drama. You invent stories about their rodent politics. You do this because if you don't, the silence will finish what the cold started. You used to mark days by scratching the wall, tallies etched with the edge of a broken spoon. You stopped when you reached 600, not because you lost hope, but because the wall ran out of space. Here's your fringe tidbit in a few documented cases. Women were imprisoned in tower rooms not for scandal, but for possessing inconvenient information secrets about inheritance, legitimacy, or even treason. Historians still argue whether these imprisonments were protective measures or just preemptive silencing. You try to remember your last real conversation. Not orders, not prayers, not muttering to moss, but an honest human sentence. It's something like, Do you want to go walking, or you look well today? You don't remember? That memory has mold on it now. Instead, you have rituals. Morning, check the window, stretch until your joints argue. Greet the spider in the corner, who might be the fourth or fifth in a dynasty of web makers. Midday. Pretend you're writing letters. Imagine the ink, the quill, the way you'd sign your name, curved and slow, under the title Lady. You imagine a reply, always warm, always delayed. Evening, breathe slowly. Count to 30. Light doesn't leave the cell, it simply dies somewhere near the center. And then, sleep. Not because you're tired, but because it's the only thing you're allowed to do without permission. There was no trial. That's the part that sticks, even now. No court, no jury, no grand accusation shouted in a hall, just a conversation you weren't invited to and a decision you were sentenced with. Your husband didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had the one thing that mattered in 14th century Scotland more than love, faith, or even good soup land. And land came with rights, including the right to decide where and how his wife should live. The excuse when it was whispered at court was adultery. Of course it was. The timeless go-to charge for locking away women who were too bold, too clever, or simply no longer convenient. No proof needed, just suspicion. And your husband was very suspicious, not of other men. Mind you of your opinions. He claimed you had dishonored him, not in action, but in presence. Here's your mainstream historical fact under medieval Scots law and custom. A nobleman could restrict his wife's movements if she was suspected of infidelity, defiance, or political insubordination. The church frowned on cruelty but rarely intervened in domestic disputes between nobles, especially if the man in question was generous with donations and had a cousin in the clergy. Your imprisonment was an arrangement, not a punishment. At least that's what they'd say. A private matter. You were never declared guilty. You were just gone. Your family didn't protest. They couldn't afford to. Not after your father died and your brother's marriage depended on your husband's patronage. One less scandal meant one more alliance, and one less sister meant one less chess piece on the wrong square. So here you are, 30 years later, and still unsure what you did wrong, except maybe possibly laughing too loudly at a bishop's joke, or contradicting your husband at supper, or reading the wrong letters, or existing with an inconvenient sense of self. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some imprisoned women were forced to sign confessions in exchange for basic comforts, access to their children, cleaner clothes, or more edible food. These documents were rarely public but kept for leverage. Historians still argue whether they were genuine admissions or survival strategies written in desperation. You remember the day he stopped speaking to you? Not with anger, just absence. A wall of silence as thick as the ones now surrounding your body. You asked what was wrong, he said. Everything. You asked if it was you. He didn't answer. And the next morning, you were escorted to this room. They said it was temporary. You are not the only one. You know this now. There are stories even here, even now. One servant muttered once about a cousin's wife who vanished into a tower near Loch Leven. Another spoke of a lady in Stirling kept in her solar until her hair went white. The ghosts of forgotten wives float just beyond the reach of history books. Their names erased with the same ink used to sign their marriage contracts. Historians still argue whether these disappearances were personal vendettas, political containment, or societal plumbing, removing clogs to let male ambition flow freely. You don't argue, you just sit. You know this chair better than you knew your own wedding bed, its grooves, its cracks, its one stubborn splinter that has lived longer than most monarchs. There are days you forget your husband's face, but never the tone he used when saying your name like it was something to be erased, not spoken. And there are nights, just before sleep claims you, when you still expect to hear a key in the lock, not out of hope, out of habit. You don't eat to live anymore. You eat because starving is too dramatic, and you don't want to give anyone the satisfaction. Meals arrive through a wooden hatch in the wall twice a day if someone remembers, once if not, and never when it rains. You hear the latch slide open, the scrape of a plate or bowl, and then silence. You always say thank you, no one ever responds. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is barley porridge. If you're less lucky, it's waterlogged bread with something crunchy in it. You hope it's a seed. You don't check. Once, you found a beetle baked whole into the crust. You named it Duncan. You buried it in the straw like it mattered. Lunch, or what passes for it, is often broth, thin, watery, with the flavor of regret and possibly onion. You once got a sliver of salted fish. It was the highlight of your decade. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Noble women in confinement were typically kept alive barely. Their meals were just sufficient to maintain life and prevent scandal. A dead wife raises questions. A starving wife in a tower who doesn't die much easier. Just enough calories to keep the body walking, but never enough to let the spirit run. The water is carried in old clay jugs. It smells like the bucket it sat in. Sometimes earthy, sometimes metallic, once unmistakably frog-flavored. You drink it anyway because thirst is crueler than taste. You learned early not to refuse food. Not out of gratitude, but because they might take that as permission to give you less. Or nothing. Hunger isn't just physical, it becomes a way of thinking. Your brain starts to measure things in bites. How long a stale heel of bread can last. How long before the next bowl arrives. Once, you found a shard of carrot in your gruel. You cried, not loudly, just quietly enough that your body shook, and the tears salted the food you still finished. Here's your fringe tidbit in a few known cases. Imprisoned noble women were deliberately fed food that spoiled slowly like dried beans, moldy crusts, or old cheese, not to torture them, but to reduce the need for servants to make regular visits. Historians still argue whether this was logistics or laziness cloaked as austerity. You keep your bowl clean, not because you're tidy, but because you've learned how ants find even a smear of grease. They march like an army. At first, you were disgusted. Now you mostly watch them. Sometimes you whisper stories as they pass, narrating their journey across the stone floor like a queen with no court left. One winter, you got nothing for 3 days. You thought maybe they had forgotten. You imagined your bones collapsing in on themselves like wet parchment. Then on the 4th day, a hot broth arrived so rich it left grease floating on the surface. You cried again. Then you panicked. What if this was a final kindness? You didn't sleep that night. You just stared at the wall, full and afraid. Historians still argue whether such brief kindnesses were bribes, apologies, or accidents. You've stopped wondering, you just eat. You always eat. Even when the bread is so hard it could be used as a weapon. Even when the porridge smells like someone dared it to ferment. Even when your hands shake too much to hold the spoon steady. Because hunger doesn't care about pride, and neither does the stone room you live in. So you chew, and swallow, and survive, again. By the end of year 7, or maybe it was year 10, it's hard to say, your mind starts growing furniture of its own. Invisible chairs, a fireplace that never lights, a hallway leading nowhere. You live in this world, but also in another one stitched from memory and dust. And that second world, it's louder than the first. You start talking to the stones, not out loud at first, just mentally. Quiet greetings, then questions, then full conversations. You imagine one of the stones is named Ewan. He's sensible, sarcastic, and always agrees with you about how dreadful your husband's hair must look now. Another stone is Mary. She's kind, but you suspect she lies to spare your feelings. You're not losing your mind, at least, not in the way people mean when they whisper it like a diagnosis. You're adapting, you're turning nothing into something. The same way people make dolls from straw, or joy from crumbs. You're still here, that's the only measurement that counts. Every morning you perform your rituals, 3 slow breaths, touch the wall. Count to 20. If you skip it, the room feels off. Not haunted, just tilted. Like reality is punishing you for not pretending properly. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Solitary confinement, especially in pre-modern times, was known to fracture the human mind. Without light, variety, or human contact, the brain invents structure. It creates schedules, patterns, even hallucinations to preserve a sense of self. It's not madness, it's maintenance. So you maintain. You polish a small pebble with the hem of your gown until it gleams. You use it to mark time, placing it on a different part of the window ledge each day. One day, you forget. You cry for 2 hours, not for the rock, for the routine it held together. You hum songs no one taught you. You hum to feel your voice echo. On your boldest days, you sing, just a note, one long, trembling syllable. The walls always sing back, even if the answer sounds like loneliness dressed as music. Here's your fringe detail. Imprisoned women were sometimes given scraps of parchment and ink, not for writing home, but to copy psalms or repentant prayers. A few turned these into coded letters or secret poems. Historians still argue whether these scraps were acts of rebellion or just survival written sideways. You don't get parchment, but you do get walls, and you've carved your name once, deep in the far corner behind a basket of rotted straw, your name, not his. Just to remember that you existed before this room, that you weren't always someone's lesson or punishment. And on the really hard days, you celebrate holidays of your own invention. Feast of the Moving Shadow, Day of the Loud Rain, the Festival of 6 Breadcrumbs. You declare them solemn occasions. Dress accordingly, which means brushing your hair, and whisper a speech to your imaginary court. The court is made up of dust mites and the ghost of your old dog. Historians still argue whether these inner worlds created during isolation were symptoms of suffering or strategies for sanity. But let them argue. They didn't sleep beside moss named Fergus. You did, still do, and tomorrow you'll ask him how he slept, and he'll say, better than your husband ever deserved. Outside your stone box, the world has not paused. It spins, it sings, it burns, and it forgets. You hear whispers of it sometimes, carried in on the feet of servants who think you're too broken or too ghostly to notice. But you do. You always notice. A maid once dropped a scarf, soft wool, dyed blue. She didn't pick it up, left it there like an accident, but it smelled like open air and someone else's freedom. You held it to your face for an hour, then buried it under straw, too precious to use, too painful to see. You hear talk of battles. Names you remember from your wedding feast are now corpses in someone else's victory song. You think he died, and then, I suppose I outlived him. And that thought surprises you. You, the discarded wife, still breathing. Your sisters are gone. One was married to a knight with a ruined face, the other eloped with a traveling priest. You overheard a servant mutter something about it, scandal, disgrace, and you smiled, because at least she got to leave the building. Your cousin Marjorie, the one with the laugh like a kettle, died in childbirth. You learned this from the cook, who said it like she was discussing spilled salt. You whisper the names at night, not because you're mourning, but because someone has to remember them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the 14th century, Scotland saw waves of war, famine, and political upheaval. Women, especially noble women, were currency in that chaos. Their names shifted on parchments while their bodies remained confined, whether in marriage, cloisters, or stone rooms like yours. Your name, you suspect, has faded. You once imagined someone lighting a candle for you, but now you know that candles are for the visible. You dream of horses, not galloping, not wild, just walking, their hooves in mud, their breath in fog. You were once small enough to be lifted into a saddle and told to hold tight. Now the memory of a horse seems as mythical as a dragon. There are moments, brief, cruel ones, when you imagine what he's doing. Your husband, eating goose, snoring in peace, complaining that no one salts the venison properly. You wonder if he ever thinks of you. Then you wonder if he ever really saw you, even before the door closed. Here's your fringe detail in certain Scottish households. Servants were discouraged from mentioning confined wives to their lords. It was considered bad luck or an unpleasant matter. One chronicler noted, "They vanish not in death, but in dialogue." Historians still argue whether this was superstition or simply silence weaponized into erasure. Once, a child's voice echoed down the corridor, laughing. You froze. It was so alien, so sharp and sweet that you nearly forgot how to breathe. A child, a real one. Not imagined, not remembered, alive, loud, and full of possibilities. You cried, not because you wanted a child, but because no child would ever know your name. Or your story. You were a preface torn out before the book was bound. You try not to hope anymore, but hope is a fungus. It grows in dark, damp places, and yours keeps growing back, no matter how many times you scrape it off. So you wait, and you breathe, and you whisper the names of people who no longer whisper yours, and the stone listens. Because someone has to. The thing about vanishing is it's not always sudden. Sometimes it's slow, like ink fading, like footsteps being buried under new snow. You realize, eventually, that you're not just locked in. You're being unremembered, and you are not the only one in the whispers and crumbs of overheard chatter. You begin to gather the names of others, women like you, once titled, once dressed in velvet and pearls, now silent notes and footnotes no one reads. There's Lady Adrena of Ross, locked in her husband's southern tower after questioning his allegiance. Lady Ailsa, allegedly mad though more likely too clever. She was confined to an attic with no keyhole, only a priest and a prayer schedule. You wonder what they saw, what walls surrounded them, what mold they befriended. Your own story fits among theirs like another cracked tile in an empty mosaic. Here's your mainstream historical fact records from the late medieval period indicate that a number of noble women across Scotland and England disappeared from public life under ambiguous circumstances, often coinciding with political strife, family disputes, or accusations of emotional instability. These women were not necessarily dead, just inconvenient. Some were wives who displeased their husbands. Others were daughters with opinions. A few were widows with wealth the crown wanted to swallow. A handful, perhaps, were genuinely ill. But more often, their illness was a husband's boredom or a king's fear. Here's your fringe detail in one record from 1372. A woman known only as the Lady of the North Wing was discovered living inside a crumbling estate, having been confined there for 22 years. When asked why, the reply from her brother was, she was better kept. Historians still argue whether this meant safer, quieter, or simply out of the way. You press your ear to the stone some days and imagine hearing the heartbeat of the others. Lady Adrena tapping a spoon on her wall. Lady Ailsa humming. Lady someone else breathing in the silence. It's a small comfort, thinking of yourself not as alone, but as part of a secret sisterhood trapped, muted, and stubbornly unbroken. You invent a ritual to honor them. Each year, though you're guessing it arrives on what you think is midsummer, you braid a thread into your hair. You whisper the names you've pieced together. You tell them that you're still here, that they're still real, that someone remembers. The servants don't speak to you much anymore, but once. The young one, the one with the scar along his jaw, paused at the hatch and whispered, I heard about the Lady of the Tower. Then he said nothing else, but you saw it in his eyes, the flicker of fear or maybe awe. You'd laugh if your throat hadn't forgotten how you feared. You, legendary you, a cautionary tale for girls who dare speak at supper. Historians still argue whether these imprisonments were acts of cruelty or just culture, that this was the accepted shape of punishment for women born into the wrong century with the right amount of spine. But the walls don't argue, they just hold your story, layer by layer, year by year, sigh by sigh. You still touch the corner where your name is carved. Not lady, just you, because you deserve to exist beyond the man who silenced you. And because maybe, just maybe, some girl 100 years from now will find your name in a ledger, in a whisper, in a dream, and she'll say she was kept, but not lost. It happens at dusk, not the soft, poetic kind of dusk you read about in stories, but the wet, colorless gray that sticks to your skin like mildew. You've stopped expecting anything from this time of day. No food, no change, no mercy. Just the slow suffocation of another page curling itself into the same old chapter. But today you hear it. The key, not the wind, not the click of the hatch, not your imagination playing tricks like it does on Wednesdays. A real key, turning in a real lock. You sit up too fast, your head spins, your bones shout, your eyes sting, and still you stay absolutely still. Because hope is dangerous, hope hurts. The door opens. Two men enter. Neither of them is your husband. One wears a crest you vaguely remember from a tapestry. The other smells like horses and iron. They look at you as if they expected something else, something smaller or more broken. Your husband is dead, says the first, as if delivering the news that winter has arrived. Here's your mainstream historical fact in 14th century Scotland. Noblemen's deaths could and often did reset the political lives of their wives. A widow regained some control over her property, her title, and occasionally her physical location, especially if there were no sons, especially if no one cared enough to keep her locked up. They don't apologize. They don't explain. They say, "You may leave." That's it. No procession, no dramatic unlocking of chains, just "you may leave." You want to stand, but your legs disagree. You brace against the wall. You forget how tall you used to be, how tall you're supposed to be. The floor feels like it's rejecting you. The air outside the door feels too big. They lead you down the hallway. Your feet don't make a sound. You haven't walked more than a few paces in years. And now, every step feels like a betrayal of everything your body learned to survive. You pass windows, real windows, with light that doesn't need permission. You don't cry, not because you're strong, but because you used up all your crying years ago. And grief isn't interested in renewals. Here's your fringe tidbit in rare cases. Widowed women released after decades of confinement suffered from sunlight shock sensitivity so intense it caused fainting, nausea, and in one recorded case, temporary blindness. Historians still argue whether it was physical damage or the mind trying to crawl back into its stone cocoon. You flinch at the brightness. You lift your hand like a visor. You whisper Ewan and wonder if the stone back in your cell misses you already. You're escorted outside. The sky is wider than you remembered. The grass is aggressive. The wind is no longer a rumor. It's a full living thing that wraps around your ribs like a new corset. You try not to collapse. You try not to panic, because the room was terrible, but it was yours. And this is everything, and everything is terrifying. Your escort says you'll be taken to a cousin's estate, a woman you haven't seen since she had all her teeth. She's a widow too now. She'll know what to do with you. You nod, because you've forgotten how to ask questions. The carriage smells like lavender and saddle oil. It creaks. You count the sounds to distract yourself from the world sliding past the window. Hills, trees, a river, it feels like watching someone else's dream. You touch your lap, your fingers, your knees, you murmur your name like a spell, the whole one. The one no one's spoken in decades. The trees don't answer. But the sky, now blue, doesn't shut you out. And that's something. That's everything. They call it freedom. But freedom, it turns out, is a room with windows that you're too afraid to look through. You arrive at your cousin's estate to polite gasps and a flurry of awkward curtsies. The servants avoid your eyes. The steward calls you lady with the same tone he might use for a cracked relic. You're shown to a chamber larger than your entire prison, filled with cushions, candles, and fresh linens that don't smell like ghosts. It terrifies you. The bed is soft, too soft. You lie down and feel like you're sinking into a cloud that might smother you at any moment. You sleep on the floor for the first week. They think it's humility, it's muscle memory. There's warm broth every morning, bread that doesn't crack your teeth. Honey, you stare at it like it's a trick. You sniff everything before eating. You eat slowly, suspiciously, expecting to gag or hallucinate a beetle. It doesn't happen. You still chew like you're rationing for winter. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many women who were released from long periods of enforced confinement experienced what modern historians now call re-entry trauma, a mix of physical fragility, psychological confusion, and profound alienation. They were technically free, but often felt like ghosts in a world that had rewritten itself without them. Your cousin is kind, at least. She tries to be. She speaks slowly, as if you've forgotten words. You haven't. You've just learned how heavy they can be. She gives you space. Space, it turns out, is terrifying too. You try to walk through the manor garden and cry because the air smells like flowers you no longer recognize. You once knew every herb by name. Now you confuse thyme for mint and call everything green. You attempt small things: embroidery, music, talking. You sew one crooked line, then stop. You pick up a lute, strum once, then put it down like it burned you. You speak only when spoken to. And even then, your voice sounds like it belongs to someone else. Here's your fringe tidbit in at least one 14th century case. A noblewoman returned from confinement and was said to never speak of it, nor walk alone in halls, for fear of doors. Historians still argue whether she was traumatized or simply exercising caution after a lifetime of being silenced. You sit near the window most days. You've begun sketching shapes in the dust on the sill, small lines that only you understand. It calms you, reminds you that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it just means peace. People stare when you attend church. They whisper, "That's the lady who was locked away." Some say you were a witch. Some say your husband caught you with a monk. Some say you died and were replaced. You don't correct them. Let them gossip. Let them mythologize what they were too afraid to interrupt. Because the truth, you were inconvenient. That's all it ever was. A woman who said the wrong thing, wore the wrong expression, took up the wrong kind of space in the wrong kind of room. And now you take up space on your terms. You eat, you walk, you breathe, deeply and without asking. And some nights, when the manor is quiet and the fire crackles just so, you whisper to the stones in the hearth, just to see if they remember, just in case Ewan or Mary are still listening. Because you didn't die in that room. You just became someone else, someone you're still learning how to be. When down 200 words, and now. As the candles flicker low and the air settles into quiet, let your breath slow with it. Let the echo of stone fade. Let the memory of locked doors soften at the edges. You've walked through years of silence, through moss and mold and shadow, through imagined festivals and whispered names, through betrayal, through numbness, and finally through a door. Maybe freedom is quieter than we thought. Maybe it isn't bells or declarations, but the slow return of your name to your own mouth, the quiet luxury of choosing where to sit, when to speak, what to remember, the softness of fabric that doesn't scratch, the taste of honey that doesn't hurt, and maybe, just maybe, a future that doesn't begin with a lock. So rest now. Let your ribs unclench. Let your heartbeat find its own rhythm. You are no longer in the tower. You are no longer someone else's silence. You are here, and you are safe. Good night. Allegedly mad, though more likely too clever. She was confined to an attic with no keyhole, only a priest and a prayer schedule. You wonder what they saw, what walls surrounded them, what mold they befriended. Your own story fits among theirs like another cracked tile in an empty mosaic. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Records from the late medieval period indicate that a number of noble women across Scotland and England disappeared from public life under ambiguous circumstances, often coinciding with political strife, family disputes, or accusations of emotional instability. These women were not necessarily dead, just inconvenient. Some were wives who displeased their husbands. Others were daughters with opinions. A few were widows with wealth the crown wanted to swallow. A handful, perhaps, were genuinely ill. But more often, their illness was a husband's boredom or a king's fear. Here's your fringe detail in one record from 1372. A woman known only as the Lady of the North Wing was discovered living inside a crumbling estate, having been confined there for 22 years. When asked why, the reply from her brother was, she was better kept. Historians still argue whether this meant safer, quieter, or simply out of the way. You press your ear to the stone some days and imagine hearing the heartbeat of the others. Lady Adrena tapping a spoon on her wall. Lady Ailsa humming. Lady someone else breathing in the silence. It's a small comfort, thinking of yourself not as alone, but as part of a secret sisterhood trapped, muted and stubbornly unbroken. You invent a ritual to honor them. Each year, though you're guessing it arrives on what you think is midsummer, you braid a thread into your hair. You whisper the names you've pieced together. You tell them that you're still here, that they're still real, that someone remembers. The servants don't speak to you much anymore, but once. The young one, the one with the scar along his jaw, paused at the hatch and whispered, "I heard about the Lady of the Tower." Then he said nothing else. But you saw it in his eyes, the flicker of fear or maybe awe. You'd laugh if your throat hadn't forgotten how you feared. You, legendary you, a cautionary tale for girls who dare speak at supper. Historians still argue whether these imprisonments were acts of cruelty or just culture, that this was the accepted shape of punishment for women born into the wrong century with the right amount of spine. But the walls don't argue, they just hold your story, layer by layer, year by year, sigh by sigh. You still touch the corner where your name is carved. Not lady, just you, because you deserve to exist beyond the man who silenced you. And because maybe, just maybe, some girl 100 years from now will find your name in a ledger, in a whisper, in a dream, and she'll say she was kept, but not lost. It happens at dusk, not the soft, poetic kind of dusk you read about in stories, but the wet, colorless gray that sticks to your skin like mildew. You've stopped expecting anything from this time of day. No food, no change, no mercy. Just the slow suffocation of another page curling itself into the same old chapter. But today you hear it. The key, not the wind, not the click of the hatch, not your imagination playing tricks like it does on Wednesdays. A real key, turning in a real lock. You sit up too fast, your head spins, your bones shout, your eyes sting, and still you stay absolutely still. Because hope is dangerous, hope hurts. The door opens. 2 men enter. Neither of them is your husband. One wears a crest you vaguely remember from a tapestry. The other smells like horses and iron. They look at you as if they expected something else, something smaller or more broken. "Your husband is dead," says the first, as if delivering the news that winter has arrived.